Magandang hapon. Magandang hapon po muli sa ating lahat. Bago tayo magsimula ay inaanyayahan po natin ang lahat na tumayo para sa pabansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Tatlong book launch para mataranta ng konti. Magandang araw po, ako po si Vlad at para dun sa mga nakasama na namin dati, bahagi po ako ng UP Institute of Creative Writing. Nasabi po ni Paige na well, talagang isa rin sa layunin sa pangkalahatan ng mga proyekto at kolaborasyon ng ICW ay paglalapit na literal ng mga manunulat na sa physical na antas ay malayo, pati yung kanilang mga aklat para ma-access natin at makabili. So siguro kung may pambili po tayo at gusto nating magpapirma, yun din po yung unang hiling natin para sa araw na ito. Nasa labas lang po ang ating mga kinatawan mula sa Anvil at nandun ang libro ng ating tampok na manunulat. Ang pagbati natin ay isang mainit na araw na sana wala pong heat stroke, sana nakakainom tayo at lahat parang tumodo naman yung mainit na pagbati. Gusto sana iambing sa mainit na buwan ng Panitikan pero syempre mag-hydrate po tayo at sana nakakapahinga pagkatapos. Salamat po sa mga makakasama natin on-site and online sa Panayam sa Panitikan, kung saan gaya ng sinabi ni Paige, itatampok ang librong The Last Days of Magic ni Ian Rosales Casocot at ang pagkakakilala ko sa kanya gaya ng nasabi ko noon, um, sa mahabang panahon ay kilala ko siya bilang online persona sa pamamagitan ng kanyang GeoCities website na Critical Survey of Philippine Literature. So tingin ko si Ma'am April Yap yata na teacher ko rin naman sa Comparative Literature 50 na parang survey din ng Philippine Literature ang nagpakilala noon. Tingnan nyo ito. At bago yung aming website na panitikanph.com, isa ito sa pinaka-comprehensive ba na repositoryo ng mga announcement, mga literary piece. I think one time nakapasok pa ako ng isang piyesa doon. So, uh, isa si Ian sa nagpapasimuno ng ganong klaseng malayang access, malawakang access sa panitikan. At syempre nitong mga nakaraang buwan, lalo na sa mga nakakakilala sa kanya, nakakasunod sa kanyang mga gawain, isa siya doon sa mga naging pangunahing tagapagsulong at patatandaan siya para dito doon sa pagkilala sa Dumaguete bilang Creative City of Literature, kasama ng Quezon City. So October 2025 I think. At malaking bagay ito in terms of pagtampok sa panitikan bilang isang importanteng bahagi ng buhay. Lagi natin sinasabi, kaya nga rin po kami nagpapa-feedback form, sana maganda yung rating. matter of funding ang mga maraming bagay sa pagsulong ng panitikan at yung mga simpleng pagkilala, parang simple ay napakalaki para doon sa pagpapatuloy at pagpapalawak ng mga proyekto na sama-sama naman nating binubuno sa pamamagitan ng mga kolaborasyon gaya nito. Dahil sa mga nasabi na, syempre maaaring kinakatawan ng ating tampok na manunulat at yung ideya nung spekulatibo, yung fantastic at magic at iba't ibang anyo ng hiwaga at yung kanyang pangkalatang advokasya ang esensya ng proyektong PAN na patuloy at paulit-ulit na ipakilala at payabungin sa hiwaga ang hiwaga at hikayat ng malikaing panulat. Para po sa mga nakasubaybay na, lagi-lagi po nasasabi na kasama sa pagpapanatili ng hiwagang ito ang pagpapalawak ng saklaw ng bawat proyekto. Kaya po bukod sa on-site, na syempre maraming salamat po sa pagdalo natin, nag-headcount po kanina kasi ano po ang aming mga project assistants ay nagpaparamihan ng dumadalo. At yung pinakaunti po ay ifa-fire. Hindi naman po, syempre babawi sa susunod na pagkakataon. Bukod po sa online, para niyo po maabot yung mga may internet access, meron po tayong online stream component. Kung pangit ang internet, syempre delayed broadcast po. Pero laging mayroong kasamang online broadcast ang ating on-site experience. Kasama rin po dito sa pagpapanatili ng hiwaga ay yung pagbuo ng archive, gaya na nakwento natin kanina. Pagsasa-arkibo na kapag may sapat na pahinga na sa mga gawain natin na sa pang-araw-araw, ito ay maaaring balik-balikan ng mga manunulat at mag-aaral ng malikhaing pagsulat o literature nga. Kaya narito, nabanggit na kanina yung mga halimbawa, may YouTube channel tayo, may website, panitikan.ph, may TikTok na nga. Baka po yung ibang writers, sila Ma'am Jing, baka makita nyo yung nagsasayaw pala doon. So check ninyo kasi yung ating mga baka lang, di ba kasi doon sikat yung TikTok, sino ba? Si Charleston Ong, baka ano pala, kumakaldag pala sa TikTok. So check nyo lang, baka lang kayo ay kumbaga pleasantly surprised ng aming content. Siyempre naroon din ang paalalang magtampok at magbahagi ng mga kwentong lumalabas sa mga teatrato bilang sentro. Noong nakaraang taon, nagkaroon na kami ng Philippine Creative Writing Forum sa inisyatiba ni Sir Butch Dalisay, si Jose Y. Dalisay Jr. At naging emphasis talaga doon na muling ipaalala na yung mga kasama nating manunulat sa NCR at sa Luzon, syempre may counterpart palagi sa ibang mga lugar sa Pilipinas. At tingin ko, isa na rin 'to at maganda na ito yung gawain ng ICW sa pagtatapos ng buwan ng panitikan. Muling pag-assert lang din at pag-reiterate na kailangan nating maging mas inklusibo at komprehensibo sa sino yung magiging kinatawan ng ating pambansang panitikan. Kaya po tinataton natin na dagdag na karagdagang ambag ang ganitong mga hakbang sa pagtampok ng aklat, sa pagtampok sa ideya ng aklat at matutulat na nasa ganitong direksyon din ang kinakatawan. Kumbaga, manunulat po na labas ng Diliman, manunulat na labas ng Kamaynilaan, na bahagi rin siyempre ng ating pambansang danas. Kaya po mula doon siyempre muling pasasalamat kay Ian Rosales Casocot na tampok nating manunulat ngayon. Palakpakan naman din po natin ang ating kasamang manunulat at kasabay po nito ay pagpupugay at pagkilala rin. Siyempre kina Paige, si Jordan din po Santos na isa sa ating mga nakakausap sa Anvil Publishing para sa pagtitiwalang hindi na ito first time kasi. So salamat sa pagtitiwala ng Anvil na ipagpapatuloy namin at naisasagawa ang pagpapatindi pa ng hiwaga at halina ng speculative narrative sa kasalukuyan. At nagpapasalamat din siguro kasi kasama rin sa, hindi ko alam kung sadya o di sadyang kolaborasyon, pero nagtatampok din kasi yung Anvil ng mga manunulat na dating na-feature din sa likaan. So halimbawa si Kimberly Derla na nagthesis sa Malikhaing Pagsulat, nagkaroon siya ng journal sa likaan, eventually ay inako ng Anvil yung pagsasalibro muli ng kanyang proyekto at nagpapasalamat kami para doon kasi importante na may pagpapatuloy at pagpapalawak ng maaabot. Wala po dito si Sir Jimel Naval pero lagi kami nagpapasalamat sa Koleo ng Arte at Literatura, kay Chancellor Vistan sa patuloy na suporta. Sa staff ng UPICW, kami po ay Bioman Color. So Thursday po ay Yellow 4. Kaya po kami Beige 4. So iniba lang po namin ang Miyerkules. Dapat kasi kung naabutan niyo pa yung Bioman, red 1, green 2, blue 3, yellow 4, pink 5. So may iba't iba po kaming kulay pero nagpalit po kami ng Biyernes. Ang Biyernes ay blue na, tapos yung Wednesday po ay pink kasi po marami sa staff ay hindi po straight. At nanonood ng Mean Girls kasi yon on Wednesdays we wear pink. So we try our best to to ano yun para to continue that yung napasimulang gawain na ito kung saan man napunta. Pero nagpapasalamat po tayo sa staff. Yun lang naman po ating punto. Siyempre meron din po tayong nagbabalik na regular collaborator si Lakan Umali, Professor Lakan Umali na nandito. At siyempre si Professor Ian Lomongo na from Rizal and UPLB rin na nagpaunlak na makasama natin dito. Katabi niya si Miss Claire na baka kung gusto niyo ng makipila sa kanyang best-selling na book ay punta kayo sa UP Press, yung Tugtugan Pamorningan. At speaking of mga nakikilok palagi, salamat po sa mga manonood. Nakalahati ay hindi required, hindi student ni Sir Rex. At hindi po hinatak sa labas. Pero syempre po para doon sa mga sumusubaybay din sa mga gawain ng ICW na nagpapa-autograph po ng libro na narito po ngayon. Maraming salamat po sa inyo. Lahat ito'y patungo sa diwa ng paniniwalang siyempre may bisa pa rin ng paglikha at nakabubuo ng mga mahiwaga at makataong mundo ang ating mga salita. So muli po, maraming salamat at magandang hapon.
Maraming salamat po, Director Vlad. Tulad po na ng kanyang nabanggit, hindi po ito ang unang kolaborasyon ng Anvil at ng Likhaan. Talagang napakasaya na makipag-collaborate with Likhaan. Punong-puno ng hiwaga, katulad ng ating librong inilulunsad ngayong hapon. Oo, di ba? So again po, ini-invite po namin kayo na i-follow ang Likhaan sa Instagram at likhaan.upd.icw at sa TikTok at Panitikan PH para po sa mga upcoming events ng Likhaan. For sure, kasing saya rin po niya ng ating event ngayong hapon. Muli maraming salamat po, Director Vlad. Ngayon, upang formal na ipakilala ang ating tagapagsalita ngayong hapon, nais ko po siyang tawagin. Pero babasahin ko po muna ang kanyang napakahaba at napakagandang listahan ng mga credentials po. Ian Rosales Casocot is a professor, graphic artist, film teacher, and critic, and an award-winning fictionist. He has won 9 Palanca Awards for his short stories, drama, and children's writing, as well as an NVM Gonzalez Special Prize for his fiction. He has also won the Neil Gaiman Fully Booked Speculative Fiction Award twice, the only writer in that award's history to do so. His books include the short story collection, Old Movies and Other Stories, Beautiful Accidents Stories, Heartbreak and Magic, First Sight of Snow and Other Stories, Don't Tell Anyone, Literary Smut, Bamboo Girls, and The Last Days of Magic. The children's picture book, The Great Little Hunter, and the anthologies Future Shock Prose, an anthology of young writers and new literatures, and Celebration, an anthology to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Diliman University National Writers Workshop. He has also edited Handulan Tao, celebrating 50 years of culture and arts in Diliman University. His novel, Sugarland, was longlisted for the 2008 Man Asian Literature Prize, the biggest prize for the English novel in Asia. A forthcoming book, The Gentlest City Imagined, is an anthology he edited collecting literary pieces about Dumaguete and Negros Oriental. He has written for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, Smile Magazine, Rogue Magazine, Esquire Magazine, and other national publications, as well as CNN Philippines and Rappler. He was a 2010 writing resident of the prestigious International Writing Program at the University of Iowa in the US, for which he produced the documentary City of Literature. He was the founding coordinator of the Edilberto and Edith Tiempo Creative Writing Center of Diliman University. He was the founding festival director of the Diliman Film Open and a former Execom member of the National Committee on Cinema for the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. He was also the former deputy director for the Dumaguete City Heritage Council, for which he edited the Hugkat Journal. He is also the founding president of Buglas Writers Guild, which successfully spearheaded the campaign for Dumaguete City to become UNESCO's Creative City of Literature in 2025, of which he is currently the focal point. He is profiled in the literature volume of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, Encyclopedia of Philippine Arts. Pinalipad po natin siya, sinomon po natin siya all the way from Dumaguete just to be here with us. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ian Rosales Casocot.
Hi guys, but I'm glad to be here kahit pinalipad mo ako. We actually just finished the third Dumaguete Literary Festival a week ago. So I've been sleepless since then, still sleepless now. That's why I was sleeping a while ago, waiting for the event to start. Anyway, for the PowerPoint, kayo lang or ako. Thank you for coming. This is actually the first time I've been in UP Diliman since, actually I was here before the fire. So the first time since then. So ang tagal na nun. So thank you again everybody for being here. I know some of you are required by Wendell Capili, a friend of mine. So thank you Wendell for compelling your students to be here. This particular talk is actually described as a lecture, and I kind of a lecture. I don't like giving lectures. I will think of this more as like a journey with me to kind of talk about the book and why I wrote the book. So I hope you will, we kind of see the difference with my, naming, calling it a talk, a journey, rather than a lecture. So let's begin. So I've titled this particular talk as the personal in the speculative, and I'll try to explain why later. So, yeah, ito ba? Okay. Okay, hello, where? Oh, okay. So this is Dumaguete, okay? We were just named the UNESCO Creative City of Literature, the only one in the Philippines so far, and only the second one in Southeast Asia, actually, after Jakarta. And so, yeah, so I'm actually happy to be here in Quezon City because we were actually named together last year. You are City of Film, of course, but I also know Quezon City to be very much a city of literature. Kaso lang naunahan kayo ng film people. They were too fast in the designation. So sorry, literary people in Quezon City. Okay, you cannot have two designations kasi. We also tried to go for music actually, but UNESCO said no. You can only go for one. Okay, literature na lang. So yeah, so I come from Dumaguete. I came here last Saturday and I've been having so much fun actually doing some book events for Anvil. Okay, and this is the book that we are trying to talk about today, The Last Days of Magic. Okay, I love the cover. And basically, my talk today will center on two parts. I will talk about the stories first because I want to showcase to you what I mean by the personal. A lot of these stories actually come from some very very personal experience and personal, I don't know, views about the world. So I will talk about these stories in that particular sense, and then I will try to define what I mean by the personal in the speculative. Okay, so let's begin. Okay, so truth to tell, this particular volume is supposed to be a reissue of this book, Heartbreak and Magic, my second book, which was first put out by Anvil in 2011, when I was already considered a mid-career writer, a designation foisted on me as a fellow of the University of the Philippines National Writers Workshop in 2008, actually. I had actually already put out another book, Beautiful Accidents, before this, but roughly within the same period. Published by UP Press. And this actually is really my first book. Although I had edited an anthology before this and also a chapbook of my stories published by the NCCA. In reality, all those stories, both in Beautiful Accidents and Heartbreak and Magic, should actually have been gathered together in one volume, a collection of my initial efforts as a writer from way back in 1999, when the Philippines Free Press began publishing my work. But in compiling the stories, I realized that they were tonally different in two very specific ways. Some were written in the vein of domestic realism, usually charting queer themes. I'm gay kasi. And some were written definitely in the mode of speculative fiction, meaning to say fantasy, science fiction, and horror. And they did not belong in the same book. So I made a decision back in 2011 to separate the two, my domestic realism into Beautiful Accidents, and my speculative fiction. Okay, my speculative fiction in okay. Go back. Go back. Oh no. It's anyway. Uy, what is happening? Magic. Okay, there you go. Okay. Um, and my speculative fiction into heartbreak and magic. And I think that was a very, very good decision that I made since the audiences for both are largely very, very different and they hit me in very different ways as well. I must admit that my writing rules are firmly in the first category, domestic realism, of serious themes done in the tradition of the fiction styles of Edelberto Tiempo, F. Cino Jose, Edith Tiempo, Butch Dalisay, Lualati Bautista, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ida Rivera Ford, these are little names, Gregorio Brillantes, Ernest Hemingway, Jessica Hagedorn, Francisco Arceliana, J.D. Salinger, Susan Lara, Enviam Gonzalez, Jaime Ann Lim, Bienvenido Santos, Socorro Villanueva, Lori Moore, Cristina Panto Hidalgo, Cesar Luis Aquino, Ruina Tiempo Trevillas, Alfred Yuson, Timothy Montes, Gilda Cordero Fernando, Bobby Flores Villasis, Mencho Aquino Sarmiento, Sarge Lacuesta, F.H. Batacan, Vicente Garcia Grion, Exi Abola. These are my mentors, guys. Lakan Binisitoy and Charles Sonong. Many of whom were my mentors. Timothy Montes, in fact, was my first writing teacher, and he wrote the introduction to Beautiful Accidents. But starting around 2005, I had begun dipping my hand into speculative fiction. Oh, sige. Okay. So I had begun dipping my hand into speculative fiction. For the most part, the idea of writing in genre, horror, science fiction, fantasy, and detective fiction actually intrigued me. So next slide, please. Okay. It intrigued me. It beguiled me. That's my word. Was I capable of writing in this vein? I was already devouring the works of the likes of Stephen King, Samuel Delaney, Anne Rice, Ursula K. Le Guin, Carl Sagan, Tolkien, Christie, Gaiman, the usual suspects for some time then, but never really thought that I could do the kind of writing they were doing. Their stories were very enjoyable and entertaining, and I didn't think of myself as an entertaining writer at all, only as a serious one contemplating family dysfunctions and queer epiphanies. I knew that, but among the Filipino writers that I love who were also major influences, I knew that Nick Joaquin and Rosario Cruz Lucero delved into the fantastical, although a lot of what they did would be considered historical fiction. There was also Luis Joaquin Katigbak, a contemporary, whose first collection was a galvanizing inspiration for many of us, and who wrote his urban stories with a fantastical flavor for Haruki Murakami. I also love the horror stories of Yvette Tan and the science fiction of Barrio Tensor Posadas. Next slide. But this woman, Rosario Cruz Rosero, was particularly influential because she actually admonished us in a lecture she gave in the 2002 Iligan National Writers Workshop that we should start writing stories about where we come from, because not doing so is a form of cultural erasure. And I delved into her stories at that time, particularly in that book, Feast and Famine. And I saw that what she did was mixing the history of Negros, where we both come from, with great swaths of the magical and the supernatural. So she essentially gave me the map on doing speculative fiction that touched on the personal, really stories about home and its history, with a lot of the magical, embellishing the sometimes grim realities of that history, particularly in Negros. You know what just happened a few days ago, right? So yeah, yun. That bloody thing is part of Negros history. And then, next slide. And then I became friends with this particular guy. His name is Dean Francis Alfar. He was mostly known as a Palanca winning playwright for most of his early career as a writer until he pivoted to doing fiction in the speculative mode. His first story in this vein was The Kite of Stars. Maybe you're familiar with that story. And I fell hard for that story. I wanted very much to follow in his footsteps. And at that time, my friendship with Dean began. This was sometime in the mid-2000s, mostly because of the website that Vlad mentioned, okay? And we maintained blogs together. We became friends online, okay? And this is how we got to know each other better. Around the time, he was also moderating a writing group called Lit Critters, which allowed its members to create new speculative fiction every so often. And I asked him if I could create a Dumaguete chapter. And when he said yes, that's when I began writing my fantasy, horror, and science fiction in a more serious way. He published one of my first efforts of specfic in the inaugural volume of Philippine Speculative Fiction series. So really, my first foray into specfic is in that particular book. Next slide. I continued to dip into the waters of speculative fiction. Hi, Nico, you're here. Okay. After that, especially with Cristina Pantoja Hidalgo, who invited me to contribute to Tales of Enchantment and Fantasy. Probably one of the pioneering publishing efforts to compile and study contemporary speculative fiction in the Philippines. And then next slide, later on, my contribution to a la carte, Food and Fiction, edited by Cecilia Manguera Brainerd, was actually a speculative fictional piece centering around a Dumaguete culinary staple, the chicken inato. Okay? So, and then there was a period, next slide, I know he's been canceled, okay? But I have to mention him. There was a period when I won the Neil Gaiman Speculative Fiction Contest in the late 2000s, winning twice in a row in a competition that lasted 3 years. So all of these efforts, guys, from 2005 onwards were what became the stories, 8 in total, contained within Heartbreak and Magic. Next slide. So yeah, which has had a more enduring general appeal compared actually to my domestic realism, to be honest about it. 15 years later, we finally have The Last Days of Magic. Okay, the idea of publishing a 15th anniversary edition of the book Heartbreak and Magic, which has been long out of print talaga, actually began in Frankfurt last year when I was part of the Philippine delegation. Okay, and I met my publisher Sandra Ramos and Ariane here and Paige. We met there, and I'm glad that they were receptive to the idea of a reissue. However, in the process of revisiting the old book, Ariane and I determined that the piece of flash fiction in it, Sarah broke up with me, did not really belong to the rest of the collection, which only left about 7, right? So it's like 7 in a book, parang kulang. So she demanded more. Okay, she needed at least 3 more to complete. Okay, 10 at least. That's what she said. But I actually gave her more than 3. I gave her 6 or 5. Okay, so a lot of new stories in the new book. So it was not really a reissue anymore. It really totally became a new book with a new title, The Last Days of Magic. Okay, so let's go through each of the story. Okay, next slide. So, A Strange Map of Time. I wrote this as my entry to the prose category of the first Philippine Graphic Fiction Awards in 2006. Neil Gaiman actually visited the Philippines in 2005 and was delighted by his discovery of the wealth of speculative stories being produced by local creatives, both in fiction and in comics mode. My story won the grand prize, much to my surprise, although I had to share this honor with Michael A.R. Ko, the husband of Mina Esguerra. This story came about because I was haunted by the urgings of, again, Chari Lucero, who wrote an essay titled The Music of Pestle on Mortar, which won the Palanca in 2003. In it, she encouraged local writers to delve into the history of the places where they came from and to create fiction based on it to resist what she called an epidemic of forgetting. I was deeply moved by the essay that she wrote, and when the call for that contest came, I knew I had to write a piece based on the history of Dumaguete, where I am from. What was burned in my inspiration was the memory of the Great Dumaguete Fire of 1981, which burned the entire public market of the city. I was 6 years old at that time, and the house we rented in was only a block away from the fire. And the memory of looking up the night sky to see it emblazoned in fiery orange will always stay with me, as it did when I was contemplating this story in 2006. I knew I wanted to make that fire a major scene in my story, but I needed something more. I was reading The History of Negros Oriental by Caridad Aldecoa Rodriguez then, and the section on the Spanish incursions into my island of Negros, called Buglas, during pre-colonial times, seemed like the perfect narrative frame. How to combine a 1981 fire and a 1565 historical note? So I had to write a time travel story then about a precocious child born in a future time who is catapulted into the distant past with the mission of discovering his ancient name. He does so syllable by syllable, with each discovering opening a portal of time which brings him to specific events in the breadth of history of Negros Oriental, including the 1981 fire, until he finds his own original era once again. This was the only way I could meld all the inspirations I had, including setting down and opening that recalled the glorious beginnings of Carl Sagan's only novel, Contact. This story was also part of Heartbreak and Magic. And then we go to the next story, this one. It has a long title, but let's just call it by, next slide. by the first few, I don't know, phrases. The death of His Majesty Philip II, Prince of Asturias. Hanggang dyan lang, okay? I have always wanted to write this historical fantasy, the beginnings of which I had already written down in 2021 during the pandemic. But it languished for the longest time in my hard drive unfinished because the historical research it entailed proved very, very daunting to me. No one has noticed this yet about my fiction, but I am obsessed with the theme of naming and of the veracity of words as sign, signifier, and signified. This story is very much an embodiment of this obsession. Okay, how can I spin a fantasy around the fact that our country was named after Philip II of Spain? It took me a long time to realize that the Philip II we memorized in our history classes was actually one of the greatest European rulers of his time, actually equal to Elizabeth I, and whose reign was very much the embodiment of what is celebrated to be Spain's Siglo de Oro, or Century of Gold, which marked the country's political and cultural ascendance and also the beginnings of European colonialism, an evil episode in world history that lasted for centuries. I wanted the naming of the Philippines to be a kind of a curse on us, okay, which has proven historically correct. But I also wanted, in a way, for the colonized to strike back at the colonizer, hence reversing that curse and let it come for the nobility who was our namesake instead. Okay, so naming it after him, naming the islands after him became his curse. The more I researched about Philip II, the more I realized that he was such an expedient ruler and also one who encountered so much heartbreaks, deaths of wives, deaths of children, and so much political defeat, like the defeat of the Spanish Armada. This is actually the last story that I wrote for this particular collection. I finished it right at the very brink of the deadline that Arian gave me, okay, last year, late last year. Okay, let's go to the next story, The Flicker, okay? This is a horror story. Actually, not my first horror story, but it's actually the one I am most remembered by. Why did I write this horror story? Because I wanted to find out if I could pen something that would scare the bejesus out of me. And actually it did, to be honest. I was scared by my own story. I began it knowing that only that I wanted to try a haunted house story, but to also try to subvert whatever expectations the reader might have in reading it. I had no idea how it would end. And the ending, which I will not reveal, was actually an organic surprise. The words and the imagery came as I was writing them, and it scared me so much I actually had to stand up and walk away from the computer. It didn't help that I finished the story sometime around 3 a.m., okay? So yun. So my second horror story. Let's go to the next, A Tragedy of Chickens. Oh, the last is, okay. I did. Okay, The Last Days of Magic. Okay, The Last Days of Magic. Okay, this particular story, actually, I submitted this as my entry to the Romeo Forbes Children's Story Writing Competition, sponsored by Canvas, because I fell in love with the piece that they offered, done by the artist Jose Santos III. Okay, the painting showed a man juggling all sorts of ordinary things, which seemed to float around him. That painting was the sole prompt, and I needed to write a story around it. It just so happened that around this time, I was getting frustrated by the reality of people I know, abandoning their passion for the arts in order to pursue more practical, more lucrative careers, especially in nursing. I thought this a huge loss for us, and I had reasons to gripe. I too almost succumbed to the temptation, having entered college intending to graduate with a degree in physical therapy and hoping to find my third year and hoping to find a job in that field abroad. I actually didn't last long in that particular program, but it was only until my third year that I realized that all I really wanted to do was to write. So I jumped ship from PT in 1996 and shifted to a more practical degree in writing, which was journalism. I would eventually end up being a creative writing teacher at Diliman University. So this was the crux of that particular story, that we are losing our magic, our artistic side, to infernal choices for practicality. The story didn't win the Romeo Forbes contest, but it won third prize in the Palanca for the short story for children. Okay, next slide. The Cataloger of Deceit. Okay, it's not in order pala. Okay, the Cataloger. Okay, the Cataloger of Deceit. Okay, this particular story was born out of two needs. First, to write a story firmly in the landscape of hinirang. Hinirang is a fantastical Spanish colonial version of the Philippines that Dean Francis Alfaro actually first sketched out in the Kite of Stars, and many writers have since contributed to making Hinirang a possibility in our fiction. So we've been writing stories about Hinirang, and this was my attempt to do a Hinirang story. And the second prompt was really to rediscover my writing muscle in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and to survive the lockdown that it unleashed. I also wanted to try publishing something for the international market, and I thought writing a story about a woman who collects other people's memories of deceit would be a good one. And this was finally published in Strange Horizons on June 2021. Next slide. What's it? Oh, The Apologist. Okay. This one. Okay. Danny, where are you? Okay, this scared the bejesus out of her when she read this. She was one of the copy editors for this particular book. I wrote this story, Dan, because I was a very angry writer in the time of the presidency of Duterte, circa 2016 to 2022. And I was one of the most vocal ones protesting the injustices of EJK and all that entailed for Filipino society. My anger spilled over to me, founding an online magazine called the Kill List Chronicles, which Facebook eventually banned, okay, which gathered literary protest pieces, but which eventually got taken down by Facebook sometime in 2019. I asked myself, how do I chronicle the horrific reality of Duterte and the DDS and their seeming enslavement to believing all kinds of false narratives that edify their leader? I felt no amount of truth-telling could dissuade people from their steadfast support of someone who professed publicly to killing and was celebrated for it. I was writing essays about this for Esquire, for Rappler, everywhere else, but never really making any dents, I felt. I turned my frustration to fiction, and what it called for was a horror story. What if a famous person admits to being a serial killer, but is so charismatic about it? He'd get into television for sure. So that's really the story. A serial killer confessing to all of his crimes on television and getting celebrated for his serial killings. Next slide. What is the next? A Tragedy of Chickens. Finally, we go back to that. Okay, this one. Okay, this one. This began actually as a food essay. A food essay. I began as a food essay for one of my columns in the Dumaguete Metro Post a long time ago, because we love this particular chicken in Dumaguete called the chicken inato. Okay, that's the culinary staple of Dumaguete talaga. Inato is the Oriental Negrense answer to inasal, which is from Negros Occidental and Iloilo. The differences between the two are stark, actually. The Bacolod Iloilo City variety is sourish, but delicious, okay? While the Dumaguete variety is very milkish. Of course, I prefer my own variety in Dumaguete. I repurposed that particular food essay into a fantasy piece titled A Joy of Chickens, a play of chicken joy, okay? For the Philippines Free Press, because I wanted to write a fantasy piece that involved food. And the essay already felt like it had some hallmarks of my own fiction style. It was also meant to be a celebration of Dumaguete food, okay, represented by its favorite grilled chicken style. Later, I was tapped by Cecilia Manguera Brainerd to contribute to her book a la carte, where I titled it as Pedro and the Chickens of Dumaguete, but eventually in the book, I titled it A Tragedy of Chickens. Okay, next. What's the next story? The Pepe Report. The Pepe Report. Okay, this one. I was reading a very, very long essay by probably one of your favorite teachers here in UP, Janil Garcia. He wrote kasi an essay titled, Was Rizal Gay? I love that essay. And the premise of his investigation was, of course, very, very intriguing for me. Was our national hero gay? Garcia tried to examine possible answers from considerable academic research, but one extrapolation he made fascinated me. He cited Leon Maria Guerrero's translation of Rizal's Memorias de un Estudiante de Manila, where the translator noted an interesting and very thorough erasure made by Rizal in the second chapter of his autobiography, referring to a nickname by which the young Rizal was teased by the burly boy classmates in Binyan. Guerrero surmised that the erased word was calambenio, but also noted that the word does not seem to be, as an epithet, sufficiently opprobrious to have called for an thorough excision by Rizal. Garcia, in his essay, wonders what this word could be, which proved to be so derogatory and opprobrious that it needed to be scored over and over again by the writer. But he continues, the clue is that whatever it was, it had something to do with the roughhousing and bullying that Rizal regularly suffered at the hands of his taller and bigger classmates who dwarfed and overpowered him at play, and whom he tried to beat in classroom contests instead. Could that erase word be a local term for what is now commonly called gay? This was my prompt. But how to go about it? I was actually inspired by the late Adel Gabot's science fiction piece, The Field, which won third prize in the inaugural but now defunct feature fiction category in the Palanca in 2000, and which imagined time travelers witnessing the execution of Rizal in Bagumbayan. The only way I could explore Garcia's premise was to do this via science fiction and through the device of a cloning story. That the story itself would end the way it did, again, I will not reveal the ending to you, was actually a total surprise for me, even when I was writing it. So if you want to find out what the secret is, read the book, okay? He wasn't gay, he was something else. Ano kaya? Okay, next slide. The Painted Lady. This is actually the oldest story in the collection, something I wrote immediately after I became a fellow at the Diliman Writers Workshop in 2000, and something I had to write to somehow exercise the memory of my breakup with my first boyfriend, which happened around the time I pursued a one-year study at the International Writing Christian University in Tokyo, Japan in 1996. The breakup haunted me for years. I did not forget him. We were both fans of Anne Rice when we were together and had gone absolutely gaga over the film adaptation of Interview with a Vampire, which came out in 1994, around the time we first met. I called him my Lestat and I was his Louis. Okay. And the ultimate exorcism had to be a vampire story then. Did the exorcism work? No, it did not. Okay. So yun. Next story. The Bodies. Okay, this one is another angry story, a horror story. This was part of my year writing horror stories that would, in all my intentions, be a reflection of the violence of the Duterte years, just like my earlier story, The Apologist. It was just the beginning of the Duterte presidency in 2016, but I was already growing concerned about the high death counts of the nascent EJK campaigns, and so I just fictionalized all of that into a horror story about dead bodies appearing everywhere. Okay, and I actually wrote this for Joseph Tacino, who commissioned 8 writers to write 8 flash fiction pieces for the Halloween 2016 issue of 8 List, an online magazine. But yeah, he commissioned me, but I did not get the flash fiction part. So I gave him a very, very long story. So I was the only one who gave him something that was not flash fiction at all. So again, an angry story about those particular years. Next story, next slide. The Greenland. Okay, the Greenland. Okay, this one is actually my... Okay, I've been wanting to write climate fiction for a while. But I wanted something that would have a happier ending, not the apocalypse we usually get into this kind of story. I also wanted something where the solution lies in the act of storytelling. I am obsessed with storytelling as well. How stories can be utilized to create a better future. I was reminded of one of my favorite Ray Bradbury stories, The Toynbee Convector. I am familiar with that, which follows a man who claims to have traveled to the future and reports of a utopia describing a wondrous advanced civilization where humanity has solved all its major problems, including environmental degradation, poverty, and war. He even showed films and other evidence of this perfect world, giving humanity immense hope. At the end of the story, however, the aged time traveler reveals to a reporter that he lied, that the time machine he traveled in actually never worked, and all the evidence he presented was fabricated. But he knew humanity had the power to create a better world, but needed a destiny, a shared goal to make it happen. His vision became a self-fulfilling prophecy, spurring generations to build the utopia he had exactly described. This was my inspiration. I wanted a lie about the future where we have solved the climate crisis, become the engine to which this lie could come true. But how to frame it? I thought of David Mitchell's wonderful novel Cloud Atlas, which hopscotches through history, with each segment set in a chronological time, first going forward and going backwards, but all of them touching each other in significant ways. I knew the future time I wanted was the year 2225. 2000, 2 to 5. And the hopscotching through time would have to happen in intervals of 200 years. Meaning to say, the second part had to be set in 2025, the year I finished writing the story, and the second part had to be set, and the first part had to be set in 1825, and would feature a real-life navigator, Benjamin Morrell, who was actually notorious for mapping geography that did not, in fact, exist. He lied about the islands he discovered. Okay, so I use that light to create a vision for a better future for everyone, especially with the climate. Next slide. And the last story, the Sugilan of Epiphania's Heartbreak. This is probably the most celebrated and I think most read of all my speculative fiction attempts thus far. I was inspired by the story of my aunt, the real-life Epiphania, whom I call Tita Fanny, the sister of my mother. Some time ago, I was interviewing my mother about her childhood in Bayawan, a town somewhere down south of Dumaguete. And it just so happened that my aunt was also present. And she regaled me with the story of her being asked to go on errands when she was a kid. And she would usually be made to buy the kerosene to light their lamps in their house of their lolo and lola in Bayawan. The old name is Tolong Nuevo, where they had grown up. Their mother, Bebang, had died from childbirth, although for the longest time, the sisters were told that their mother was taken away by a spirit who lived in a nearby mango tree, simply because she was too beautiful. They believed this story for so long, actually, even until adulthood. Anyway, my aunt would go on this errand to buy the kerosene, always given 5 centavos for the lamplight fuel, but would actually buy only 3 centavos worth, and the rest of which she would use to buy candy, which she would consume all by herself, never even sharing it to my own mother. I found this petty larceny actually funny, and I vowed to write a story around it somehow. It just so happened that in 2007, they also announced the Neil Gaiman Awards, and I again joined it, and I won second prize this time around. Okay, and also around this time, Ma'am Jing tried to solicit contributions for that particular book I mentioned a while back, and she also included this particular story. And I began writing the story inspired by my aunt and her Bayawan story, hoping to kill 2 birds with 1 stone: contest entry and anthology contribution. I also wanted to write a Bayawan story for so long, again inspired by Charlie Lucero's call to write fiction about the places where we came from. I also wanted to write a story set in Hinirang, and to write something that would involve Visayan mythology, and also something that would perfectly encapsulate what I knew about heartbreak. My stories are all about heartbreak. I consider myself the connoisseur of heartbreak, okay? Hence the title of my first collection, Heartbreak and Magic. I wanted my thesis to be, you cannot force anyone to love you back. Diba? You might love somebody, you cannot force them to love you back. That's the ultimate truth about these things. The story again won the contest, but I had to settle for second prize this time around, sharing that distinction with Yvetan. First prize actually went to Joseph Dacino, my inspiration for the Buddies, and also the character of the journalist in The Apologist. So Joseph Dacino apparently is in a lot of my fiction. Okay, so yeah, it was later adapted into a one-act play as Ang Sugilano ng Kabiguan ni Epifania, written by Alexander May Cardoso, who is with us right now. In 2017, this play was part of the Virgin Love Fest 13, okay? And it was staged by the Cultural Center of the Philippines, which later won the distinction of being restaged in the following edition of the prestigious Play Festival, okay? And the play have had many outings all over the country. And the first time I saw this in the CCP, like, oh my God, that's my Lola, that's my auntie. It was really weird to see, you know, my relatives embodied on stage by other people in the story that I wrote, which was adapted by May. Thank you, May, for doing that. Okay? So, next slide. The thing is, guys, I rarely try to make sense of my own stories. That's why I was kind of scared about this particular lecture. Oh my God, I'm lecturing for UP. Wow, maybe they're expecting something. You know, I rarely try to make sense of my own stories, much less investigate their own themes. I wrote a short story once titled Things You Don't Know, which won the Palanca in 2008. And I simply wrote it because I was enamored by the vision of a very young girl wearing an angel's costume and refusing to change over the course of many days. Writing it, it became a drama about a family racked up by secrets. But when a certain university in Manila, actually your university, Nico, Ateneo, was taking it up in their literature classes, the students, I was later informed, later read that particular story as a story of faith, which made me laugh because I have never considered myself to be that kind of writer, a writer of faith. Me? No. But when I reread the story, I saw where they were coming from, why it was for them a story of faith. The point is, I may have written the stories, but I leave it to readers to find out what they actually mean, and they're usually correct. But for the purposes of this talk, I've tried my best to glean some sort of theme or meaning from this collection. When I was asked by Likhaan what the title of this talk is going to be, I simply went with my gut and said, the personal in the speculative. I think in my guiding you through each of the story, you could see what I meant by that. Every single one really was written because of some personal experience, of some personal need that needed clarity in the form of fiction, but also needed the magnification via the device of the speculative. But here are some clumsy personal takes on meaning making. What do I mean by the personal in the speculative? For me, it's when stories that deal with the unreal, for example, magic, ghosts, strange bodies, altered time, imagined histories, are really about private, intimate experiences. The spectacle and the fantastical inventions is there to service real life grief, real life memory, longing, regret, and the quiet ways we try to understand ourselves. In other words, next slide. The strange elements in these stories are not really the point, they're just the language. Okay? Next slide. For me, speculative fiction is not an escape, but is expression. People often think speculative fiction is about escape. But the stories in the last days of magic don't really feel like escape for me. They feel actually closer to confession, to be honest about it. Stories like The Flicker, The Cataloger of Deceit, and The Apologist will all deal with people trying to make sense of unstable realities, but that instability isn't just out there. It is in fact internal. Okay? The stories are what it feels like, next slide, when you can't trust your own memory, when you keep revising your own story, and when you're not sure about what's true anymore. Okay? And the next slide, I am also fascinated by time. I like writing about time. And for me, time is deeply personal. In A Strange Map of Time, time travel isn't really about science. Oh my God, no science there at all. For me, it's an illustration of dislocation. In the story, the character Sawi moves across different moments and different worlds, but what he's really looking for is actually a sense of self. It offers a personal plea. What if there are many versions of you and none of them feel right? Okay. In the next slide. And part of time is actually this, that my belief that the past doesn't actually stay put. Some of the stories deal with history, but not in a distant way. In the death of His Majesty Philip II, for example, the past pushes back, and the power doesn't just fade. It returns, it haunts. In the Sugilan of Epiphania's Heartbreak, storytelling feels ancestral. It is like something that carries memory across generations. The past is not over. It lingers and it insists to be felt. Okay, next slide. I think my stories are also attempts to explain the unexplainable. Several stories revolve around people trying to make sense of things. For example, the Pepper Report tries to document reality, the Apologist tries to explain psychopathic behavior, and the Cataloger of Deceit tries to organize what can't be organized. And none of these attempts fully work. Some experience resist clarity, and we try to narrate them anyway. But next slide, I also write about love. I love love. I love writing about love, especially heartbreak, okay? Which for me is the center of many of my strongest stories. For all the strangest, many of these stories are about love and what remains after it. In the Sugilan of Epiphania's Heartbreak, heartbreak is turned into something almost mythic, and I really intended to be that way. In fact, I don't know, I frame it like a story, like an old Visayan tale that people actually talk about again and again. And I think you got that, May. May's adaptation actually is a very, very, I love it because she departed a lot from my own story. She took one particular line from my story about people drinking tuba and telling the story of Epiphania again and again and again, and made it into the strongest framework for the play. So something like that, something mythic. people telling tales again and again and again. Okay, so yeah, uh, other stories approach it more quietly, but the feeling is the same. Something is lost, and something is remembered, and something is always unresolved. And then, next slide, there's my ultimate obsession, names and identity. In my stories, names matter. In a strange amount of time, knowing your name means knowing who you are. Okay. In the death of His Majesty Philip II, naming becomes both curse and control, with the king actively claiming, possessing, and rewriting, even as the gods of what is thought of Philip make his life a living hell. And in the Catalogue of Deceit, naming becomes an attempt to fix that what keeps shifting actually in the history. So naming is never neutral in my stories. It's about identity, and sometimes it's about power. And I actually wrote about this extensively in a piece that the Lakan journal published some time ago. I can't remember the title, and I can't remember my titles for some reason. But yeah, in that particular essay, I really wrote about why I am obsessed with naming. Okay, so why the speculative? Next slide. So why the speculative to map out the personal? Why tell these stories this way? Why not just write them realistically? Because sometimes realism can't quite hold the feeling that stems from the personal. Sometimes grief feels like something is haunting you, memory feels like moving through time, and regret feels like another life you have almost lived. The speculative mode gives shape to these feelings. We imagine strange things not to escape our life, but to finally describe our lives actually. And to sum up, I don't think I will ever tire from writing speculative fiction. And I am glad that Anvil has given me this chance to put all my old stories again and mixing them with my newer ones for the enjoyment of another generation of readers. Speculative fiction in horror, in science fiction, and in fantasy has allowed me not just to reconsider my own life in the metaphors of the fantastical, but also to seriously talk about what ails my country, what I think about history, and what we can do to make this world we live in become a better place. And I think it has done just that in the most entertaining, hopefully, and coercive ways speculative fiction can often accomplish its message. Thank you for listening to my talk. Sorry, I haven't had any sleep lately, so anyway. So
Palakpakan po natin muli si Ginoong Ian Rosales Casocot para sa kanyang lekturang pinamagatang The Personal in the Speculative. Nakakatuwa po, no? Napakagaling. Mula sa kanyang mga personal na karanasan, nakabuo siya ng isang aklat na puno ng puso at ng hiwaga. Sa Anvil Publishing po, naghahanap at naniniwala po kami sa mga akdang Pinoy na mananatili sa mga mambabasa, mga kwentong sumasalamin sa mga nangyayari sa lipunan. At makikita po natin yon dito sa The Last Days of Magic. Kaya para po sa ating mga gustong maging manunulat katulad ni Ginoong Ian, write what you know and write where you are. Ngayon naman po dadako tayo sa reaksyon sa tagapagsalita upang palalimin ang pagkakaunawa natin sa mga naibahagi ngayong hapon. Tinatawagan na po ang ating mga reactors. Sa isa ko po silang ipakikilala. Si Ginoong Ian Lumongo ay isang guro, aktor at manunulat. Nagtuturo siya ngayon sa Departamento ng Humanidades, Universidad ng Pilipinas, Los Baños. Kabilang siya sa mga tagapayo, tagapagtaguyod at naging dating pangulo ng Neo-Angonong Artists Collective. Naging scholar, apprentice at kasapi rin siya ng Tanghalang Pilipino Actors Company noong 1999 hanggang 2004. Ang salin adaptasyon niya ng Night Mother ni Marcia Norman para sa Philippine Educational Theater Association ay nagkamit ng 2019 Gawad Buhay para sa Outstanding Play Translation Adaptation. Palakpakan po natin si Ginoong Ian Lumongo. Ang susunod po nating reactor, siya po ay isang Filipina writer, instructor sa University of the Philippines, Diliman's Department of English and Comparative Literature. Palakpakan po natin si Binibining Lakan Umali. Siyempre, sasamahan din po sila ni Ginoong Ian Rosales Casocot dito sa harap. Muli, palakpakan po natin ang ating tagapagsalita at ang kanyang mga reactors.
Ah, maraming salamat po sa likhaan sa karangalang ito na maging reactor sa panayam ni Tokayo. Tokayo si Ian. Oo. Parang feeling ko nga parang doppelganger. Wala lang. Hindi kasi nung 1976, pumunta ako sa Sikihor tapos nagtatampisaw ako dun sa tubig. Tapos nadunod ako na parang pakiramdam ko forever. Sabi ko walang nagdidikta sa akin tapos biglang pag-ahon kong ganun. So syempre hikain ako, hinihika na ako tapos pero siguro several years after na-imagine ko parang namatay ako at yung pag-ahon iba na yung ibang iyan na yung pumalit sa akin. Parang sa Sikihor, oo, parang mga ganun na kwento. Tas ay sorry, para ano ba, wala lang yung mga ganong ano, mga yung interest ko sa Bisaya, yung
Where's our neighbor in Dumaguete?
ah,
One island away.
tapos nung 2006 yung sa NCCA na yung Ubod, doon tayo nagkakilala sa Penguin. Yun lang, parang so ang daming mga layers ng ano na may nagsabi sa akin, ikaw ba si Ian Casocot? Sabi ko, kaya nga parang sabi ko, hindi. Tapos, yun. Tapos sabi ko, hindi. Tapos, parang sa ibang table kayo ano, na Sir Jimmy. Tapos, ano, yung siguro yung una kong gustong banggitin na yung talagang yung fascination sa mga pangalan, yung magic, 'di ba? Yung sabi nga nila, 'di ba? Yung pagpapangalan ay pagkakaroon ng kapangyarihan dun sa bagay na yon. So parang yung shamanic ano na parang to have the power to name things is to have power over them. So yun yung magic na aspeto na yung pagbibigay ng pangalan ay isang uri ng kapangyarihan na yun nga, magical para sa akin ano. Tapos siguro baka kasi maligaw na ako yung ang dami kong naiisip na mga ano na mga gustong-gusto ko yung magic ng pagmamahal, 'di ba? Na I think it's the greatest magic that one can have to be able to love and realizing that you cannot force anyone to love you. Parang it's a kind of a magic that's kind of letting go of power. Parang ganun yung nai-imagine ko doon. Parang ah sorry.
Maybe just to give some insights in this person. Uh, Actually, I did not mention it in my talk kanina, but I don't know why I think naming is very, very powerful for me because I grew up, in an evangelical household. And very biblical yun di ba? The first thing that Adam did was to name all the animals. Okay? And then in the New Testament in John, my God, I'm teaching right now. And then kung John, di ba? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. So kind of, I think that just stuck to me, and I kind of found a new meaning. I just kind of found new meaning to the act of naming, and that's why I have been writing stories about it forever. Okay, and you talk about also about you cannot force anybody to love you, which is very present in the last story, the Sugilan of Epiphania's heartbreak. And maybe just to spoil na lang the ending because this is an old story anyway, and May already wrote a play about this. The boy did not love her back, but he was sorry about it. But she still loves him. Like, love me. I will destroy the world if you don't love me. And then the boy tells her, but I don't love you. I will destroy the universe, but I don't love you. And I'm so sorry. And then she cried and she turned into a mango, which he eats. Kinain niya in the end. Which is kind of like, parang, for me, that was a good consummation. Like, if they couldn't be lovers, she might as well eat her as a mango. Diba? So, ganun. Sorry for spoiling the ending, Arian, okay? But this is an old story anyway. And this was in the Virgin Love Fest. So, ganun. Yeah, heartbreak is powerful. Love is powerful. And even though you can't get the love that you want, maybe something magical can happen out of that particular heartbreak. Wow. Yeah. I really like heartbreak stories.
Ako rin. Kaya siguro parang nakaka-relate talaga ako sa mga kinukuwento ni Tokayo. Ah, Nung 2022 na alam mo yun, nagpunta kami nung wife ko dun sa Dumaguete. So we came to visit two. So we came to visit Sikihor. And then so si Richard, yung kaibigan ko sa Niyonggo, no, namatay nung July 16. That was the fiesta in Talinting, ni Nueva. And then afterwards, pumunta kami sa Dumaguete. Pero I have always been passing through Dumaguete but not really experiencing the place. So he invited us to mag bar hopping and art exhibits, yung may mga performances doon na medyo magkasama tayo. Oo nga, magkasama tayo. Tapos nag-inom tayo ni na Renz, di ba? Yung we went, yun. Tapos, pandemic nga, parang, medyo maluwag na ng konti. And then, sorry, ang dami kong baka irrelevant na yung irrelevant na yung sinasabi ko. Ang ganda talaga nung, ang una ko nabasa kasi syempre, I started reading the book chronologically from the first page. So si Sawi na tuwasan, ang ganda sa akin nga yung pagbikas nung pangalan, yung unti-unting pagbabalik dun sa identidad niya. Tapos na-fascinate din ako dun sa yung old man, 'di ba? So iniisip ko si old man, si Laon, 'di ba? Malamang, ewan ko lang, parang naisip ko lang si Laon yun na personified. And then gusto ko rin yung parang pagtatambal nung si Legazpi ba yun? Si Legazpi kasi ang tawag din sa kanya, 'di ba, El Viejo. So parang the old man or the elder, pero kumbaga yung counterpart niya yung white and black, and the black old man. Sorry, parang um, yung sorry, kailangan ko ng code ko siguro. Hanapin ko lang kung ano pa yung ah, so magkasunod yun, 'di ba, yung The Death of His Majesty, tapos yung talaga yung sumpa ng pagbibigay ng pangalan. So kasi 'di ba parang gano'n naman talaga sa Bisaya, 'di ba, parang yung sumpa o yung barang o kung ano man, 'di ba, oo, na 'pag may sinabi kang isang salita na makapangyarihan, lagi sinasabi nila parang kinakailangan mo ng panabla ng kasi puwedeng bumalik sa'yo, 'di ba, yung pambabarang mo at yung sumpa na yun na wala lang, parang nagre-resonate talaga sa akin yung lahat ng mga kagaguhan ko nung bata ako, yung mga pagmumura ko, minura ko nanay ko, yun parang, ah, sorry, ang dami kong gustong sabihin. Gustong-gusto ko rin 'tong yung Flickr. Naalala ko si Tony Perez for some reason. Naalala ko yung isa sa mga huling Cubao series niya, yung bata dinukot sa Kalaw Cubao, Cubao Kalaw. Parang may gano'n ding bahay na nawawala yung mga bata na parang serial killer din siya. Pero yun nga,
Children in that story.
sorry, sorry kung may spoiler. Tapos, siguro magtatapos na ako. Hindi ako umabot tapusin yung buong libro. Nandun pala ako sa The Apologist. Ah, pero gustong-gusto ko rin tong The Last Days of Magic. Parang naalala ko rin yung The Great Little Hunters. Yeah, na yun, binabasa ko sa anak ko, si Bulan. So, 5 years old na si Bulan ngayon. Tapos, yun nga, parang tuwan-tuwa siya 'pag binabasa ko, parang bonding naming mag-ama na yung Singayam. Tapos alam mo 'pag ginawa yun sa LB, ginawa nilang inadapt nila as Handog.
Yeah, dapat ko shadow play.
Shadow play, oo nga, oo nga. Ay, sino? Ikaw ba?
Children's book ko.
Oo, yun nga, napanood namin yun. Si Bulan kasama namin nanood nun. Tapos parang, pero medyo iniba lang yung character, ginawang babae yung singayam. Pero, buo naman yung kwento. Yun lang, parang siguro tatapusin ko na, baka, na, siyempre, una ko nabasa na akda mo yung yung, siguro may nabasa ko ibang essays na nakikita sa internet, pero ang una kong librong nabasa ay yung The Great Little Hunter, na parang talagang nung pagbabalik ko sa Siquijor, tapos nagkakwentuhan tayo, nagiinuman tayo, bar hopping tayo sa Dumaguete, parang yung mga craft beer na ininom natin doon. Ang sarap. Gusto ko makabalik uli sa
You have another great part.
Dumaguete, sa Siquijor. Oo. So yun lang po. Salamat po kung medyo meandering, tapos mga kwento-kwento lang. Pero talagang parang nakaka-excite yung Tapos, babasahin ko to sa mga susunod na araw. Tatapusin ko. Salamat Ian.
Ian.
Kayo.
Hello, ako po si Lakan. Maraming salamat sa Likhaan at Anvil sa pag-imbita sa akin sa event ngayon. Maraming salamat din po kay Ian at Ian sa pagtanggap sa akin ngayon. Siguro pwede ako magsimula sa una kong pagtuklas kay Sir Ian, yung mga akda niya. So, I'm sorry, I'm doing an age reveal. I first read Sir Ian's work when I was 17. That was 13 years ago, noong 2013, sa isang... no, sir. I read your first short story, yung A Strange Map of Time, sa anthology ng Fully Book of the winning speculative pieces. It was A Strange Map of Time and then The Sugilanon of Epiphania's Heartbreak. Kasi lumaki ako sa mga writers tulad ng sinabi ni Sir Ian, no? Yung mga foreign writers like J.R.R. Tolkien, George R.R. Martin, Samuel Delany, Ursula K. Le Guin, no, writers of speculative fiction from the West, which is fine. They're very amazing writers. They've established all of these great imaginative worlds. Pero nung binasa ko yung anthology na yun na galing Fully Book, dun ko unang natanto na parang, ay, pwede to gawin sa Pilipinas. You can do these kinds of works, fantasy, science fiction, horror, in the Philippine setting. You don't necessarily have to look outwards sa labas ng Pilipinas, which to me then was a revelation because I didn't know na pwede natin yun gawin. This is something I often say, but I believe that realism, and many critics believe that realism is a relatively new phenomenon, no, realism in literature, because if you look at yung kasaysayan ng Panitikan, if you look at, for example, our oldest stories, the folk tales that Sir Ian engages with very richly, Don Quixote, even in Jane Eyre, there's that sudden appearance of a ghostly voice telling her to go back to Rochester, no? Realism is generally a new phenomenon. If you look at the oldest stories, their folk tales, their epics, or the fantastic, they exist alongside the real. And para din naman sa akin, hindi lang panitikan yung sinusulat, no? Yung panitikan yung kinukwento, yung pinapasa mula sa lolo hanggang apo, and that's something that May highlighted very skillfully in the oral nature of her adaptation of Sugulano of Epiphania's Heartbreak with all the drunken old men drinking tuba. So I believe that by engaging with these fantastical elements in our lives, that creates for, I think, more complicated, richer literature, which this book, this collection really illustrates. So talagang nakuha ko, naakit ako sa mga unang kwento na nabasa ko sa anthology na yon. Kaya pumunta ako sa UP Press. May hinanap ko yung mga libro ni Sir Ian. At meron ako nahanap yung Beautiful Accidents, yung pinakita niya. Ibang hiwagay na tagpuan ko doon. Kabaklaan. Okay. So inaasahan ko na may mga kapre, tikbalan. Pero yun pala, ang dami ng mga bakla, ang dami ng mga bayat na taga-Dumaguete. And then, but I was also mga heartbroken bakla. And I was also heartbroken, sir, because the stories were also so beautiful, no? Whether it's in speculative fiction or in the realist mode, there is that very visceral emotion, which is, I think, is present in all of Sir Ian's stories. I think I'm revealing my sheltered upbringing, pero una kong na-encounter yung term na cruising, yung konsepto na cruising sa kwento ni Sir Ian. And I distinctly remember the line where the young narrator talks about holding the boy's hand and kissing his lips and tasting cheese curls and Coca-Cola. Tapos doon ako niyak na parang, ay, ganito din pala pag-ibig.
That's the last story that Nick Makilahok edited.
He died very happily, I'm sure, after reading that. And then also reading his other stories in the collection, Preet Sampras's Neck, for example, that very long, there's also another very interesting story that was written as one paragraph, whose title escapes me right now because it's so long.
Something bitch.
Something bitch, like take it all bitch. Like initially I was expecting something sexy, but the title is referring to na parang, oh, you have to take this entire story all as one paragraph. And I do feel, sir, also that even your speculative stories are very queer. Like for example, The Sugulan of Epiphania's Heartbreak really spoke to me as a young bakla because diba marami mga fantasies natin bilang mga batang bakla, yung ma-in love sa straight na hindi tayo mamahalin. Pero dahil mga Katoliko tayo, gusto natin maging martir. And therefore, we find some kind of meaning or significance in that suffering of not being...
Epiphania's bakla.
Epiphania's bakla, no?
A woman, but in my own estimation, she's a gay man.
She's trans. She's trans. She's an assigned female at birth trans woman. I'm even reading, for example, A Strange Map of Time. I was so shocked at how sensual fiction can be with the lovemaking scenes when he encounters that impenetrable heiress, which he later on penetrates. And also reading, for example, The Flicker, which was a very compelling and chilling story that I first encountered in Philippine speculative fiction, volume 10. No, reading Sir Ian's works really helped open me up to the idea of what fiction could be. That fiction could really encompass all of these themes while still retaining that emotional human core that can resonate with anybody, kung bakla ka man o hindi. Pero kung bakla ka din naman, parang mas mag-resonate siya kasi matatakbuhan talaga natin yung mga sentimento tulad ng hindi pagtanggap, hindi pagtatalik, hindi pagbabalik ng ating mga pag-ibig. But, I would tell other friends there are different roads to sainthood and martyrdom. So hindi natin kailangan magpakamartir. And I was, and more than also reading fiction, I remember around 2016, which was the first election I voted in kasi nag-20 na ako noon. Doon ako nag-20. Naalala ko nung malapit na manalo si Bongbong Marcos, who is our current president. Pero noong 2016, talagang parang neck and neck sila. It was really a nail-biter, that election night when Leni Robredo was slowly catching up to Bongbong Marcos. And then it was at the last hour when she finally surpassed him and everyone was so happy. I remember everyone at that time, I think at that time there were all of those burgeonings of not burgeonings because the Marcoses came back as early as the 90s, no? But at the time there was that prevailing discourse that of the rehabilitation of the Marcoses, of the whitewashing of the Marcoses, of how come Bongbong Marcos had become so popular at this point, no, despite the well-documented atrocities committed in martial law. And for some reason, no, I think I was an anthropology undergrad, but I was still really interested in literature at that time. And a lot of people would ask me, Lakan, what books about martial law should I read? And I'd always go back to the list you made on Goodreads, sir, of martial law literature.
So there are no books on martial law. So I compiled a long list of books about martial law because I was so angry.
And that, sir, was really what I would point people to na parang, ay, itong listahan po. Basahin niyo itong listahan. Kasi na-compile na yun lahat. I don't know where it is now, sir, if it's on Goodreads. I don't know if I have a Word. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if I have a Word document somewhere where I copy-pasted the list for the sake of posterity because I got paranoid that Bongbong at the time would win the vice presidency and erase any remnants of anti-Marcos culture, including anti-Marcos literature. But, he's president right now. We are facing grotesqueries and atrocities that we might not have expected before. And I do also understand the response to that of being cynicism and disquiet and the threat of surrendering. But I do think that in literature, it's a very fertile ground to imagine something different. I remember Sir was talking about how it's not necessarily escapism in fantasy. A lot of people do think it's escapism, but it's confronting the unsettling elements, the slippages in our lives that we can't necessarily rationalize or find a logical explanation for. But I also remember what the writer Ursula K. Le Guin said, where she said, what's wrong with escapism? Because if you're an animal in a cage, if you're a bird in a cage, much like many of us are, that we're in this cage of, late stage capitalism where if we're not useful, the world buries us before we're dead, no? We're in a cage. So what else can we do except imagine how to escape? No, imagine how to escape from this cage, which is imprisoning more and more of us and providing us all with less and less space to not just imagine, but also to act. And I do feel that, the last days of magic and literature in general, it provides us with greater space. I think no undergrad ako, I kind of resonated with what Sir Ian said kanina na that he entered initially in physical therapy. And I remember, Sir, yung introduction in Tim Montes, A Beautiful Accidents, where he said he first encountered you in his communications class and journalism class and said, oh, this boy can't be a journalist because he writes so lyrically, which is the opposite of what they expect in journalism. And I also entered initially in anthropology thinking that there wasn't a feasible career in creative writing. And I'm, of course, very grateful to my background in anthropology for teaching me so much about engaging with people, asking the right questions, which is why I think writers should come from multidisciplinary backgrounds and should come from different disciplines, engage with different disciplines. But it was in reading, local literature, Philippine literature, when I realized, oh, that act of writing and imagining is equally important as everything else. I think I would like to end my reaction with a line from The Last Days of Magic, which really stuck me when I read it when I was 18 years old. When I first read it in an anthology of young Filipino writers published by UST, which I bought kasi nandun yung prof ko at that time who is Francesca Cue, who is now my colleague, and which you dedicated Things We Don't Know to. Now, I remember when magic was when everything seemed to be at the rock bottom. No, the main character of Last Days of Magic says, "We write to express what the moon can only glow." And I think that's a wonderful sentiment and wonderful idea, that we write to be able to communicate something that, because it's the only way we'll be able to express ourselves and show our hearts to the world. Thank you so much.
Maraming salamat po kay Ginoong Ian Lomongo at kay Binibining Lakan Umali para sa kanilang pagbabahagi. Para po sa kalaman ng lahat, kakagaling ko lang po sa Dumaguete last week para sa Dumaguete Literary Festival at meron akong natutunan na salita, dagit. Sir, please correct na lang if I'm wrong. It means to snatch, to swoop, or to enchant. At mukhang nadagit ang ating mga reactors ng The Last Days of Magic. So palakpakan po natin ulit sila. So magkakaiba ang kanilang pinanggalingan, magkakaiba ang kanilang karanasan, pero pinagsama-sama sila ng panitikan. Yan ang hiwaga ng pagbabasa at yan ang isa sa mga unang hakbang para tayo maging mulat, malay at nakikisangkot na mamamayang Pilipino. So let's read more, di ba po? Ngayon naman po ay bubuksan na natin ang talakayan. Kung kayo po ay mayroong katanungan, ay magtaas na lamang po ng kamay para maabutan ng mic. At para po sa ating mga nanonood sa Facebook Live, maaari po ninyong i-comment ang inyong mga tanong. Sasagutin po ng ating panel ang inyong mga tanong.
Magandang hapon. Congratulations. Okay. Nung young journalist ako, sabi sa amin ng mga boss namin, they actually preferred graduates of philosophy, economics, or some social science course. And parang nakaka-insecure kasi communication arts graduate ako. So I wanted to ask you, so journalism pala yung tinake up mo. So how did it help you, yung background mo sa journalism and PT sa pagiging fictionist?
Hello. Well, to be honest, my heart wasn't really in journalism. I like I said earlier on, I chose this because if I had to shift to anything after physical therapy, and if I had to choose writing, the practical side of writing is the thing that I should probably go for. So I did not go to creative writing, for example, which we had in Diliman. I went to journalism. I went to mass communication because of that. But when I was in mass communication, I was already writing more stories than news. Okay, I did become the editor in chief of our newspaper, of our campus paper, but really my heart was really more on creative work. Okay, in fact, I turned down a bureau chief position for the Manila Times after I graduated because I did not see myself actually, pursuing news. Like, no, parang hindi. So even then, I was already I just used it as an excuse to get out of physical therapy, to be honest. Okay, but my heart was really in creative writing. But in terms of like influence, oh my god, language, for example. I tend to write in a Nick Joaquin way, the fluid, mga ganun, but I find that when I'm more concise, I'm more straight to the point in my stories, it actually becomes more powerful. And I learned that particular technique from journalism. So yun, the brevity, the brevity actually becomes more dramatic sometimes in our fiction. But it's so hard to do, especially with the style that I have chosen for myself, which is really very Nick Joaquin-esque. Di ba? Nick Joaquin, one sentence, 3 pages. Mga ganun. So yeah. So in terms of that, I learned that from journalism. And of course, the question always to question, what you see out there and try to kind of reflect on what you see on your own fiction. Okay. Napaka-journalist mo, Claire. Okay.
Meron po ba tayong mga nais pa pong magtanong? Huwag po tayong mahiya. Sige po.
Hi po. I just want to ask, parang, what was your thought process into going into horror as a genre in order to express your feelings and thoughts, especially lalo na po nung Duterte regime?
The thing is, I really love horror. I love watching a lot of horror movies. I love Stephen King in the Philippines. Yvette Tan was always the one doing horror for the longest time, diba? Although so many writers are now doing horror, like recently Sarge Lacuesta came out with his horror novel. So ang dami ng horror writers ngayon. But I've always loved horror talaga as movies, books. Oh my God. I read, for example, I think It by Stephen King, and I refused to put the book beside me, when I go to sleep because I would have nightmares about it. So I've always been fascinated by horror. The fascination was always there, but I never really thought of myself becoming a horror writer until I saw the likes of Yvette Tan trying to do it. One particular story she wrote, it's actually again a gay story. Oh my God, gay. Stella, yeah, the Tianak story, the Stella for Star, which is about two gay men who adopt a little baby who turns out to be a Tianak, and that fascinated me. So, oh my God, gay people. Oh my God, Pinoys. Oh my God, Tianak. Oh, you can do this pala. So maybe I can try to do the same thing. And for the most, I think naman nga, you can really use horror to be a commentary on society today. So I was horrified by what was going on in 2016 to 2022 ba yun? And the only way I could actually really talk about it, because I was writing op-ed pieces. I was writing think pieces for all of these magazines, newspapers, but parang walang it wasn't effective. Nobody was reading it. So maybe if I could try to write it in a more entertaining way, in a horror story, maybe people will, I don't know, listen more and realize more the horror of what is happening in the world, especially then. So ganun. So I just tried to turn to horror because I thought that my that my think pieces in Esquire, in Rappler, they were not being read. I was so angry, but nobody was reading them. So horror story na lang, yun.
Thank you po.
Eto, meron po tayong tanong dito.
Hello po. Okay, so you mentioned po kanina that when you write speculative, it's yun nga, that the whole point of the talk is personal and speculative. And in my mind, I was thinking, should character archetypes be abandoned altogether, or can these be utilized in a new manner, in a new light?
No, architects are architects because they're forever. right? What I do though is that I know that there are certain expectations about certain archetypes, and you use them, but you subvert them in the narrative. Like you try to use it in another way, in a sense that keeps them fresh, because the reader is accustomed to these archetypes, to these narratives, but then you give them something else different, and then I guess that's where the power lies, because it's a bit different now, although they are familiar with it. So the familiar with the unfamiliar together at the same time. I think that's what makes those kinds of stories, using archetypes but using them in a different way. They're more powerful because of that. So don't abandon archetypes. They're there for a reason. They're archetypes because they are, forever.
Thank you po.
Do we have questions pa po? Wag po kayong mahiya. Dito po ta harap.
Hello po, Sir Ian.
Yeah,
So,
you look familiar.
I'm Ivy po.
Hi.
Ma'am Merle's.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I'm now working with UP Press. So yung question ko lang po is, I actually read the Sugilanon of Epiphania's Heartbreak when it was published in Heartbreak and Magic. So yung original na book. So actually fascinated ako kasi parang yung since I read a lot of myths, 'di ba, na parang yung ganon na how do you explain a particular phenomenon, like what our ancestors do? So do you make sense of paano nagkaroon ng gumamela, ng sampalok, na parang may curse or parang may unrequited love, gano'n. So parang ang refreshing lang nung parang nung take na ginagamit ang myth or like explaining certain phenomenon, 'di ba, na pwede pala gano'n na, and then you localize it using names, places na familiar na tayo. So tsaka parang this is not a question but more on like parang reaction na lang
Thank
din.
you.
Na actually parang sir, you talk about writing about where you came from. So para sa iyo ba sir, parang is there like nakaka-contribute ba ang living in Dumaguete
Yes.
in your literary career also, and since you also write about speculative fiction na may pagka-rural ang setting or parang may Dumaguete vibes na gano'n, na parang so nakakatulong ba siya? Kasi ang
Yes.
alam ko po kasi parang for example, when it comes to like fantasy, 'di ba merong urban na for example, ang dami na ngayon na set in Manila, set in
Yeah.
like for example, the 13, 'di ba, na yung ginagamitan ng folk elements ang mga lugar sa Manila. And then there's also the like the semi-urban communities. So maganda la po siyang idea kasi nga parang ang mga lugar din nawawala or nag-i-evolve. So
Yes.
parang maganda na nasusulat natin yung tungkol sa mga nangyayari sa mga lugar natin in such a way that they will be documented
Yeah.
even through fiction.
That's why I obeyed Charin Lucero, because he said nga, if you don't write about it, that's cultural erasure. So you're probably the only writer from your hometown, so that's your duty and responsibility to write stories about it, to make people remember, all of these things for, I guess, for a long time. And you asked me if living in Dumaguete has helped me in my conjuring of this text. Yes, it has. To be honest, I've been tempted by so many people. Why don't you teach in UP? Why don't you teach in Tantineo? My God, yeah. But I chose to stay in Dumaguete because I find that my purpose is there. Wow, purpose talaga. My purpose is there. And at the same time, I'm also kind of reminded by what Edith Tiempo once said. She was asked, why don't you leave Dumaguete? Why don't you go to the United States or Manila? And then she said, I love the Dumaguete shoreline. That's her short answer. And I feel the same way. And I feel we can extrapolate by saying, I love stories about Dumaguete, because actually, guys, I actually teach a workshop on writing about your hometown, and your hometown is so rich of probably tales, secrets that you can actually use in your fiction or even your essays or drama or whatever, okay? For example, okay, I love Dumaguete. I love the way that people love, the For You bars, Sikihor. I love that people love the food there. I love that people love the literary ferment there. I know that people love Dumaguete in particular ways. But actually, yeah, and I kind of try to put in the magical about Dumaguete in my stories. But actually, for me, it's not just the good things, the magical things that I write about. I actually also write about the bad things, which are actually juicier. So I'll give you one particular example, actually two, okay? In the Man Asian Literary Prize that came out in 2008, there were 5 Filipino writers who were longlisted. Si Miguel Suho who won, Clip Yuson. Then there was Lakan Umali and me, and we're both the Dumaguete writers, Lakan Umali and me. Yeah, Sweet Haven. Okay. I'm going to talk about Sweet Haven actually. Sweet Haven came about because of the Dumaguete sex scandal of the early 2000s. If you remember, okay, like that was that was actually the first geographically identified porn, that was peddled everywhere in pirate stores, like before Bacolod sex scandal, before Lasal scandal, whatever, the Dumaguete sex scandal came first. And she was so fascinated by that story. She went to Dumaguete, we talked about it, and she formed Sweet Haven. She wrote the novel Sweet Haven about that sex scandal. And my novel for the Man Asian was actually about our serial killer. We have a real life serial killer. I won't name names, okay? But he was a very, very handsome haciendero who was so dashing that he beguiled women, and every time they would be with him, if they get impregnated, he would kill them, bury them in his hacienda, and people know about it. People talk about it for the longest time. In fact, he was taken to court for it, but he was friends with the Marcoses, so he got away scot-free. But actually, his end was very, very dramatic. Like, because he got away, the NPA, the Alex Broncayo Brigade, actually ambushed his car near the first St. Paul's in the country, which is in Dumaguete. In that intersection, they riddled his car with bullets. So namatay siya. A serial killer in Dumaguete who was a hacendero. So I wrote about that. So all of these stories about your hometown, not just the touristy tales, but also the dark tales, which are actually juicy. And I find, oh my God, Dumaguete is rich with all of these stories. Why should I leave it? And why should I abandon writing about it? Because it's very, very rich. Although sometimes when I join the Palanca, I don't actually write about Dumaguete because it's so obvious if it's about Dumaguete, it's me. So I usually set my stories in Bukidnon, in Baguio, because I don't want the judges to know, Ian Casocot to. So yun, I avoid writing about Dumaguete every time I write. I write for a contest in the Palanca, for example. So yun, weird. Okay. But your hometown is rich with all of these stories. So, and nobody else will write about them. So why don't you try? That was what Shari Luceret told us. It's cultural erasure if you don't.
Yun lamang po ang ating oras para sa mga katanungan. Pero feel free po to approach Sir Ian mamaya at ang ating mga reactors kung meron pa po tayong mga tanong o comments, di ba? Maraming salamat po Sir Ian at sa ating mga reactors at sa ating mga audience members. Mas lalong naging makabuluhan ang ating diskusyon dahil sa inyong pakikibahagi. Bago po natin formal na isara ang ating programa, ay pakinggan natin ang pangwakas na mensahe mula kay Assistant Professor Rex Sandro Nepomuceno, ang Deputy Director ng Likhaan, UP Institute of Creative Writing.
Maraming salamat, Miss Paige. Maraming salamat sa mga naiwan pa rin po dito. Maraming mga dito ay mga estudyante ko. Again, maraming salamat kay Sir Ian Rosales Casocot, kay Professors Ian Lumongo and Lakan Umali sa pagbabahagi generously ng mga bagay na ito sa atin. I-relate ko ito dun sa klase namin because a lot of my students were here a while ago. They're my students in speech therapy, public speaking, and persuasion. We were dapat yung klase namin ngayon was supposed to be about memory. Tapos sabi ko dito tayo kasi who else, I don't know, what else better for an example ng pagsusulat about memory than, I don't know, yung topic ng lecture natin today. I was particularly, struck by the point na when we think about memory, we think about it as something that's fixed, na parang hindi mo mababago, because it's something of the past, it's something na nangyari talaga. But I think what was exemplified today was that memory is a very malleable thing. It's a very flexible thing. And sabi nga ni Sir Ian kanina, yung past ay never nakakulong lamang din talaga sa past na yon. At sana magamit natin yun. Siyempre, Sir Ian writes speculative fiction, but maybe hindi yun yung sinusulat ninyo. Maybe it's a speech, an essay, a drama, or anything else that's creative. But still, ang gandang panghawakan nun that yung memory man natin, gaano man ito ka-traumatic, gaano man ito ka-blurry na, because that's, the ontology of memory. It's meant to be, forgotten. Pero gaano man ka-blurry, gaano man ka, porous, gaano man ka hirap siyang panghawakan, it's okay. Because when we transform it into something else, then it becomes a new memory. When we pass it to other people, it becomes a new memory. Ayun, maraming salamat po para sa, sa araw na ito. At syempre po, para opisyal na, saraduhan ang ating tawag dito, Panayam sa Panitikan ngayong umaga, ay hapon na pala, ngayong hapon, nais po naming ibigay ang mga sertipiko na ito sa ating mga tagapagsalita, sa ating tagapagpadaloy. Babasahin ko lamang po This certificate of appreciation is given to Ian Rosales Casocot, a speaker in Panayam sa Panitikan, the Personal in the Speculative. Given this 30th of April, 2026 at the Palma Hall, University of the Philippines, Diliman, signed by our director, Dr. Vladimir B. Gonzalez, and myself, Assistant Professor Rexandro Nepomuceno. Muli po, palakpakan natin sila at ang para po sa mga nais pa nating pasalamatan, syempre, we also recognize Professor Michael Ian Tiamson Lumongo bilang reactor natin ngayong hapon. Professor Lakan Umali, also a reactor sa ating Panayam ngayon. At syempre, si Ms. Paige Jose, na naging moderator natin, tagapagpadaloy sa hapon na ito. Konting photo op lamang po para sa documentation na. Sir Vlad? Photo bantaan makasya. Para pagkatakas na ako.
Magkakaroon lang po tayo ng group photo. Inaanyayahan po ang lahat na nandito pa, dito po sa harap. Kung meron po kayong kopya ng mga libro ni Sir Ian, makikidala na lang din po. Habang ongoing po ang ating group photo opportunity, gusto lang po naming magpasalamat muli sa lahat ng dumalo sa Panayam sa Panitikan o PAN, Episode 3, The Personal in the Speculative, a lecture